Over this Lenten journey, we have been looking at the 7 signs of Jesus as told by John. The 7 signs that John provides with us give us a more complete, a more full image of Jesus. And so over the last month, we have heard of Jesus turning water into wine at the wedding, healing the royal official's son, healing the paralytic. And last week we heard the story of Jesus feeding the 5,000 with 2 fish and 5 loaves. The sign of Jesus feeding a crowd that was both physically hungry and spiritually hungry for the nourishment that they found with Jesus. This morning's reading comes directly after last week's reading. Last week's reading ended at verse 15 that said, Jesus, knowing that they intended to come and make him king by force, withdrew again to a mountain by himself. And so we pick up this morning at John 6 from verse 16 to 21. When evening came, his disciples went down to the lake, where they got into a boat and set off across the lake for Capernaum. By now it was dark, and Jesus had not yet joined them. A strong wind was blowing, and the waters grew rough. When they had rowed 5 or 6 kilometers, they saw Jesus approaching the boat, walking on the water, and they were terrified. But he said to them, "It is I, don't be afraid." Then they were willing to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the shore where they were heading. And we thank God for his message to us this morning. The 5th sign that demonstrates who Jesus is Jesus who walks on water. Jesus who comes into the storm to offer guidance. Another moment where we see God's work on earth through Jesus and through another miracle that he has performed. The crowd that had been with Jesus, the crowd that he had fed, were so impressed by his power and the miracles that they were seeing from him that they saw him as a solution to their problems. They were hopeful that they could make him king and he would bring a better political and military situation to them. But Jesus was not on earth to solve that one political problem. He was working with a much greater agenda, a much greater purpose. And so after he dismisses the crowd, he moves away to a mountaintop to be alone and to pray. In our own lives, we are bombarded by noise. There's long to-do lists. There's constantly people calling on us, constantly things that we need to do. And all of this noise crowds around us. And we cannot hear Jesus in all of this noise. As we take our guidance from him of how to live, we take the guidance of moving away from the noise, moving away from everything that crowds our life and clutters it up, and move to a mountaintop to pray. The crowd wanted Jesus to be their king with all the best intentions. They wanted him to fix their political problems. What they wanted from him would have created a distraction from what he was here for. So many distractions come into our own lives, many of them with the best intentions. Good intentions that will solve problems, but they distract us from what God has planned for us. It is in those times when we move away to be quiet with God, when we remember to sit quietly with him, that we recognize who God is, what it is that he has planned for us, and we recognize the guidance that Jesus has placed over our lives. It's in those moments that we remind ourselves of his guidance, that we also remind ourselves of the importance of trusting Jesus. Jesus had sent the disciples out onto the boat, and he went up to the mountain alone. The disciples had spent most of the night rowing and getting nowhere. They were rowing across the Sea of Galilee, which is a very strange lake. It's several hundred feet below sea level, and so surrounded by these huge canyons, huge winds can come sweeping down them and cause a mighty storm quite suddenly. It can suddenly whip up waves, create these tempests that make it very difficult to row from one side to the other. The lake itself is not particularly large. It's about 19 kilometers wide and about 11 kilometers long. But in this moment when the disciples were trying to get across the lake, there was a huge wind that was making it very difficult for them. After 6 or 7 hours, they had only gone halfway across the lake. It was dark, they were tired, wet and weary, and Jesus was not with them. Then all of a sudden, they saw a figure approaching them on the water, and they were terrified. They thought that they were seeing a ghost. John doesn't use the word ghost, but Matthew and Mark do. If we are in the middle of a lake, of an ocean, of a dam, and we see a person walking towards us, we would be terrified. We would think that a ghost was coming towards us. And most of these disciples were hardened fishermen. Their livelihoods relied on being on a boat in all kinds of weather conditions, struggling against winds and waves to make their livelihood. They were physically strong men. They were emotionally tough. And in this moment, they were helpless and they were terrified. Like many of the signs that Jesus performs in John's Gospel, the accounts in themselves are quite simple, but the truths that are in them are incredible. The message of the fifth sign is, Jesus is the Lord over creation. He is the Lord who can walk on the water. He is the Lord who has control over the storm. We can think of many times and many moments where we look at nature and we see the beauty of God. We see a sunrise or a sunset, we see a field of flowers, or we see the mountains and our breath is taken away at how beautiful nature is, at the majesty of the God who created all of that nature. And we also understand the fear of nature. We know the fear of how powerful the waves of the ocean are. We know the fear of earthquakes or hurricanes or tornadoes. And in the face of natural phenomena like this, we feel so small and we feel so fragile. What can we really do against a storm, against an earthquake or a hurricane or powerful waves? Jesus is the Lord over all of that. The wind is no obstacle to him. The water is no obstacle. He walks on top of the water to come out to his friends. Right before this, the disciples had just witnessed Jesus performing the miracle of feeding the 5,000. They had been spending all of this time with him where they were seeing the power and the miraculous control Jesus had over all of creation. They were seeing all of these incredible blessings pouring out. And if we look at our own lives, we can see so many times where there are wonderful moments. We can see blessings and miracles. We can see all the places where God is guiding us, nourishing us, and working in our lives. And just like the disciples, we are witnessing all these miracles, and then the storm kicks up, and we feel very alone. And suddenly our focus is on the crisis, it's on the storm, and we feel like Jesus is very far from us. The disciples were trying to row in the dark, in the storm, not knowing which way they were going, not knowing how to navigate their way across. And when they saw this figure approaching them, they were paralyzed with fear. Fear can consume us. It can overcome our senses. It can overcome our logic. In a moment of panic, a moment of crisis or tragedy, we can become so focused on our fear and so controlled by it that we truly feel alone. Christ's voice in the middle of the storm says, "It is I, do not be afraid." There is no reason to be scared of the storm or what we can see in the storm, because Christ is in the storm with us. And if Jesus has power over the waves and the wind, he has control over the entire natural world. He has control over death. There is nothing that can come into our lives that is beyond Jesus. There is no storm we may face that he cannot take control over. It is in the midst of our storms that we know Jesus to be our God. When things are joyful, when things are easy, it's a lot easier to acknowledge Jesus as our God and follow him. When the storm starts, when it gets difficult, that's when we really need his guidance. And that's when it's a little bit more tricky. The fear that the disciples felt was connected to the feeling of being separated from Jesus. Up until now, he's been journeying with them. They've been spending all their time with him, witnessing, learning. He's been showing them who he is. And then, in a very human way, they are away from him for a few hours, and suddenly they forget. Suddenly they're terrified. They're so focused on the storm, they're so focused on their own tiredness, on this figure that they see, and suddenly their trust wavers in the face of fear, in the face of a storm. In every storm we face, Jesus offers us his presence. He offers to be the anchor that gives us guidance. And we know that the storms of life will always vary. They will vary in their size and in their force that they come to us with. There may be obstacles that we just need to get over one thing, get through one task one day, and that obstacle will have ended. Or there are struggles and difficulties that seem to continue for a while. And then there are also tragedies that are sudden and horrifying, and they seem to bring our life to a standstill. And in all of those storms, Christ is in the middle of them. And he comes to be with the disciples, be with his friends. He comes to be with us. We may be there right now. We may be in a place where we feel that we're standing on the edge of the shore and it's getting dark and we need to get moving, and we're worried about when Jesus is going to show up to help us. We may already be in the boat and the storm is raging around us, and we're trying to look around and trying to find where our focus should be. When it gets dark, when the way seems unclear, and it feels like we're so far away from Jesus, how long do we wait for him to show up? Do we trust that he will show up? And this is a difficult question, because as Christians, we know the answer should be yes. We know we should say, yes, Jesus will show up, and I know. But when the storm starts raging, And when it starts getting dark and difficult and that fear starts creeping in, it's a little bit more difficult for us, just like the disciples, to always know. Our trust starts taking a bit of a beating by our fear. And so we want God's guidance, and we're saying, Lord, please help me and guide me, but it doesn't feel like we can see him yet. And then we question, do I stay on the shore? Do I get in the boat? Do I start moving? The difficulties won't end. The bills keep piling up. This tragedy seems so great. How long do I wait for God? When those circumstances come into our lives, there's no one-size-fits-all answer. We don't know which circumstances are the ones we should stay on the shore for, which ones we need to get in the boat for and start rowing. The constant truth is that Jesus will always show up. Even when our fear paralyzes us, even when we feel like our trust is taking a beating by that fear, and we're scared and we're starting to worry, Jesus will still show up. His promises to us are that he will never forsake us. He will never leave us. And we can trust in those promises because of who Jesus is. Because he is the Lord of creation. He is the Lord who walks on water, where the storm does not stop him. When our trust fails, it's because of who we are, not because of who Jesus is. But the very good news in that is that Jesus is patient with us. He knows who we are. He knows that as soon as his disciples are away from him for a few hours, they start getting scared. They start to focus on the storm. And in that, he loves them. He loves us. And he continues to show up for us. He continues to keep his promises. And so in response to this constant truth that we can trust Jesus, he will show up, we have control over our attitudes. The storms of life are inevitable. There's nothing that we can do to prevent them. They will come and they will be different in their force and in how long they last. There will be some that feel like they are crushing. And in those storms, in the times where we feel that we've been waiting on Jesus, we can't see him yet, we're scared, we choose to continue to worship, continue to serve, and we will see him. We will see his presence in the storm, because he is there. But it is our nature that the storm kicks up and we get distracted. And so we quieten ourselves down, we refocus, we continue to serve, we continue to worship. And that is when we can hear Jesus' voice clearly again. It is I, do not be afraid. In verse 21, once the disciples recognize Jesus, they are willing to take him into the boat. In some other versions, it says they are glad to take him on board. If you're in a boat in the middle of a storm and you take on more weight, it doesn't seem like the logical decision to get to where you're going. But as soon as the disciples realize that it's Jesus, they are so happy for him to come aboard. And as soon as Jesus gets on board, the boat reaches the shore where they were going. The disciples who spent most of their days on boats, who spent most of their days on fishing boats in different weather conditions, in this particular storm, they felt like they couldn't navigate their way. They felt inadequate, they felt fearful, and they didn't know what to do. As soon as they recognized that Jesus was with them, They knew that was how they would get to where they were going. Jesus is there to navigate us through the storms, to guide us to the other side. That means we have to let him on board. We have to give him control. And for many of us, we have journeyed with God for years, for our entire lives, and so we know all of this. It sounds like information that we've heard so many times, but new storms come up, and we start trying to take control again. And we're waiting for Jesus, and we think, okay, I think I can do this. I think I can do it on my own. I can keep rowing. I can navigate my way there. We need a constant reminder that Jesus needs to be in control. We have to give up the helm. We have to let him get in the boat. I don't know if you can say you drive the boat. I don't know what the terminology is. But we need to sail. We need to let him sail the boat, direct our ways, and navigate us to the shore. Jesus is the creator of all things. He upholds the universe with his word. The unmanageable storms that come into our lives are inevitable, but they are nothing compared to the power of Jesus. They are nothing compared to our Lord, who can walk on water and calm the storm in our lives. Jesus, who can be trusted because of who he is. In his goodness and in his glory, he will always show up. We may need reminders that we can trust. We may need reminders to tell Jesus that he's in control and actually let go of control. But when we wait on the Lord, he will be there. When we trust he will navigate us through the storm, he will. So wherever we may find ourselves this morning, whether we feel that we are still on the water's edge, we are in the boat, we're in the middle of the storm, we can take comfort in the idea that Jesus is present. He is right there with us, and he will guide us. He will take us to the other side. There will be times where we need to try and remove the distractions. There will be times where maybe we need to move away a little bit to get away from the noise. But Jesus is still there. He is the constant. And so in response to him, we continue to pray, we continue to worship and serve him, and he will guide us. He will guide us to the place and the purpose that he has destined for us. Just like the crowd who wanted Jesus to fix their problems right now. That was not what Jesus was here for. We may have times where we think the storm is all we can see. We think we're never going to see the other side of the storm, of the tragedy, of the crisis. Or we're so distracted with so many other things we have to fix and solve that we wonder if we're on the right path. We wonder if we are following the direction God wants to take us in. But Jesus can be trusted to show up every day and show up every time and guide us. Just as the disciples rowed for 5 or 6 hours and they got nowhere slowly. They got about halfway through the lake. It was only when Jesus joined them that they reached the shore. They reached where they were going. And we thank God for his message this morning to us.